Some people compare the current situation with Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, this mess in 2008. Do you think it's comparable or it's not comparable?
This seems to me more benign.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me and sharing your macro vision with us. It is my pleasure to have a conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. First of all, let's get to the interview. The outlook for monetary policy has shifted in the US from rising interest rates to 5.5% to a further rate hike in May and maybe in June, the first rate cut. Do you think the Fed may lower rates at the meeting?
At the next meeting in May.
In June. I mean in June.
June.
Yeah.
I think it's I would say our view is that it's very unlikely. I think the market is pricing in about a 50% chance of a hike in May. I think that if you look at some of the recent pronouncements by the Fed officials, they indicate that there's a strong preference to continue to ring-fence the bank stress problem and focus on fighting inflation. It is very possible, and it has been acknowledged, that economic growth will ultimately slow more rather than less as a result of these recent developments, and that the Fed may end up raising rates by less or not lowering rates not staying rather at a specific elevated level of rates from the policy perspective as long as they may have envisioned before. But I think there's still a very strong aversion to imminent cuts. Committee.
Bueno, con esta primera parte, comentario que hago por mi lado. La primera quiero ir como ya directamente al hueso, ¿no? Es decir, ¿veis probabilidades de que los tipos de interés empiecen a bajar en la próxima reunión de junio? No en mayo, sino en junio. Claro, yo le digo próxima reunión y entiende mayo, ¿no? Pero yo me refería a junio, es lo que le matizo. Y aquí ella dice que no, que le parece que es muy pronto como para que empiecen a bajar los tipos de interés en junio. Y luego dice que bueno, que el cambio de hoja de ruta, lo que habéis podido ver a lo largo de la entrevista. Me sorprendió en el sentido de que aquí estamos viendo muchos expertos de mercados, de economía, etcétera, que ya sí que dan por hecho que puede haber recorte de tipos en el mes de junio, mes de julio. Y desde su punto de vista, una responsable que además está en constante trato, que tiene contactos dentro de la Reserva Federal, que ha trabajado en el Fondo Monetario Internacional, dice, y nos lo ha dicho en esta primera pregunta, que, y esto pues por hacer el análisis, que le parece quizá muy pronto, ¿no? Todo esto. Así que me parece fundamental, ¿no? Esta primera toma de contacto. Seguimos y luego ya veremos cuándo volvemos a pausar.
Talking about the situation of the banks, that's it's in the focus of some economists right now. There are investment banks that already consider banking crisis is over right now. What is your view? Do you think there could still be a contagion effect with the banks?
I think that the Fed facility has done a lot to alleviate the pressures on some of the banks that may have had large deposit outflows and at the same time mostly invest in long duration securities. I think that credit quality probably remains a concern going forward, especially if the macroeconomic environment continues to deteriorate and banks have to provision more for losses than they had in recent years. Recent years, the credit conditions have been very, very benign. That said, it depends on the sector you're looking at. There's some sectors like the commercial real estate, for example, that we all know even before this started was under pressure. So of course it's going to be the first one that people will point to as potential area of stress. That said, large diversified banks have very varied exposures. And I think there, for instance, if you look at high yield issuers or investment grade issuers, a large percentage of the US corporates fund not directly from bank loans, but they fund in securitized markets. and spreads there really remain, I would say they've widened, but they they're not at crisis levels. And at the same time, few firms need to roll over large amounts of debt this year or even next. So I do think that there are some guards in place to potentially stem the contagion.
And do you think the measures that implement Fed are quite good to fix this problem in the near term?
I think they've rolled out this facility very quickly, and I think that while smaller banks, probably partially out of precaution, initially funded through the Federal Home Loan Bank system, you saw the increased short-term note issuance from FHLBs when this kind of got exacerbated with the Silicon Valley Bank situation. But at the same time, this has abated recently, and I think partly it's because the funding is shifting to the Fed's facility. And the Fed's facility is very helpful to these banks because they can fund for, up to a year with just post their securities at par. It's quite helpful.
Bueno, antes de irnos a esta pregunta, por hacer un balance de las dos cuestiones, fijaos, otro titular importante que deja esta entrevista con Sonia Meskin, que dice varias cosas que yo creo que son interesantes, ¿no? El commercial real estate, es decir, los activos inmobiliarios de inmobiliario comercial, es la parte del crédito que es más preocupante. Esto ya lo hemos hablado aquí en mis programas durante muchas ocasiones, ¿no? Luego dice que la facilidad de la Fed, que esa ventanilla de liquidez que ha abierto, ha permitido que durante un año muchas entidades que han tenido problemas puedan refinanciarse y es un soplo de aire fresco. Y esto pues quizá de eso, un poquito más de tranquilidad, pero que las señales de preocupación próximas, y esto ya os digo que me parece a mí un titular importante, si tenemos que mirar algo que nos preocupe, ¿dónde tenemos que mirar? ¿A qué tipo de activos tenemos que mirar? Al real estate comercial. Me parece que es súper fundamental. Ahora ya veréis que le pregunto si hay similitudes de la crisis bancaria con Bear Stearns y Lehman Brothers. Ahora iremos a esto. Por cierto, antes de esto, quiero dar las gracias a Aka Kem Joffer por seguir el canal de Twitch. Os invito a los nuevos que estéis por aquí, si os gusta el contenido, que lo sigáis o que os suscribáis si queréis apoyarnos a nosotros de manera altruista. Además, bueno, podéis evitar los anuncios que os saltan aquí en mi canal de Twitch, que lo sepáis. Si os suscribís al canal, que lo podéis hacer gratis un mes con Amazon Prime, tenéis ahí un botón que es Blue Reminder y podéis suscribiros gratis con Amazon Prime durante un mes. Además, como os pasa por ahí, Chris, el enlace del canal de Discord. Bueno, y dejando lo que os va apareciendo la entrevista por aquí por el chat, que yo encantado de leeros, que sé que estáis por aquí escuchándola y viéndola, así que y dejando lo que os parece por aquí por el chat y seguimos reaccionando, reproduciendo esta entrevista aquí en exclusiva a Sonia Meskin, responsable macro de Estados Unidos de Bank of New York Mellon IM.
Some people compare the current situation with Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, this mess in 2008. Do you think it's comparable or it's not comparable?
This seems to me more benign. You never really know, but I think the most direct channel we're going to see from this situation is a little bit more of a focus on credit quality going forward, rather than the whole side banking system contagion.
It appears that banking crisis has further stoked the prospect of a recession in the United States. And in all my shows, I have commented that up to 7 leading indicators of economic recession have been triggered, from inverted yield curves to rising U.S. employment seasonality. Do you think that in Q2 or Q3 there may be direct signs of recession?
Yes, I think the risks of a recession have risen, and I think that if banks are as an intermediary to the real economy, if they come under increased pressure, be it from valuation of their securities, valuations of their other assets such as loans, and higher funding costs and more stringent regulatory environment, all of that combined, of course, makes them all else equal less likely to lend. So that does, all else equal, increase the chance of a slowdown in recession.
And how could impact to unemployment rate? Federal Reserve estimates maybe 4.4%, something like that. Are you agree with this estimate?
Well, so here's the thing: the U.S. economy is so strong still, and especially the labor market so tight, that in order to bring inflation down to its 2% objective, you might need unemployment to go up by quite a lot. So in some sense, this crisis may be helping. Right? If it doesn't metastasize into a large-scale 2008 type scenario, which is not our central scenario, it actually, all else equal, is probably helping the Fed weaken the labor market and bring inflation down.
And related with inflation.
Un segundo antes de seguir con esto, porque me parece fundamental. Voy a tirar un poquito para atrás para ver esta parte que dice entre líneas. Fijaos, es que esto me parece súper fundamental y además, habiéndola escuchado y reescuchándola ahora, me reafirmo más, ¿no? Cuando le pregunto de la tasa de paro, ella ya da por sentado que va a venir una recesión económica en Estados Unidos. Lo da por sentado entre líneas. No dice que sea una crisis como el 2008 y de hecho lo dice. Dice, esto no quiere decir que sea una crisis como el 2008, pero el hecho de que el desempleo suba va a ayudar a la Reserva Federal. Y lo dice en la propia entrevista. Me parece que es fundamental esta parte que comenta entre líneas, que no habla de que va a venir una crisis ya, pero sí que dice, bueno, este tipo de crisis tal. Vamos a escucharlo de nuevo, veréis. Esta crisis puede ayudar. Pero no como en 2008, no es el escenario que planteamos.
All else equal is probably helping the Fed weaken the labor market and bring inflation down.
And related with inflation target, I want to ask you about, do you think inflation may be stickier than expected?
I think it is, yes. And I think part of this has to do with psychology, and part of it has to do with, once you start once inflation accelerates, there are certain contracts that mechanically adjust with inflation both in the US and in Europe, and that perpetuates, increases in the price level probably longer than they would have otherwise.
So it will take time to have inflation below 4% or 3%, more or less?
I think that, there are base effects as well that we should keep in mind. You could see some dip below 4%, sure. But I think that if inflation, for example, ultimately ends up being persistently at 3 to 3.5% core PCE, it would be a bit of an embarrassment for the Fed with the 2% objective.
Coming back to recession, to recession questions, how deep do you think the recession could be? Maybe cyclical recession or financial crisis? What's your point?
Well, it's very difficult to give a precise estimate of these things. I think that the jury is still out. On once we enter a recession, how deep it'll be, right? Because there's always going to be pockets of uncertainty and pockets of weakness that may not be visible in the times of strength, but get exacerbated in times of weakness.
And this is a controversial one. Do you consider that the Fed has lost some of credibility? I mean, Federal Reserve talks about transitory inflation, and then hiking interest rates at the most as the most speed in the last maybe 3 decades or something like that, and then they talked about soft landing. Do you think maybe their credibility has changed or something?
I think it's investors do by and large recognize the uncertain environment, and a lot of folks in the private sector also had difficulty forecasting inflation correctly. So I do think that folks recognize that the Fed is operating in an environment of increased uncertainty. And I think that they moved really quickly last year when they realized that inflation risks staying more elevated and more persistently elevated than they originally thought.
So, in your opinion, should the Fed change?
Un momento ante esto.
Should the Fed
Bueno, primero, que he visto que ha habido, lo que estáis comentando por ahí por el chat, que ha habido uno de los subtítulos que se ha colado como una erratilla. No os preocupéis, no pasa nada. ha sido un pequeño error, no tiene la menor importancia. Yo creo que el resto lo habéis entendido correctamente. Bueno, resumen de toda esta parte de Sonia Meskin, a mi modo de ver, lo que me parece más importante, sigue diciendo que, claro, la Fed está entre la espada y la pared, ¿no? Ahora mismo, con la credibilidad en entredicho. Y dice, será muy embarazoso. Eso me ha parecido una frase como muy destacada, ¿no? Dice, sería muy embarazoso si la si la inflación es persistente entre el 3 y el 3,5% durante algún tiempo, la Fed puede tener una situación embarazosa de a ver qué hace. Porque si en ese momento decide subir el objetivo de inflación por encima del 2%, entonces su credibilidad sí que queda completamente dañada, y es algo que, insisto también aquí, creo que entre líneas dice, no considero que este sea la opción más plausible, es decir, el hecho de que muevan el objetivo de inflación. Muchas veces desde aquí yo mismo he dicho, joder, pues al final no les quedará más remedio que tener que subir el objetivo de inflación. Pero habrá que ver a nivel comunicativo, si esto ocurre, cómo lo hacen y de qué manera, ¿no? Porque ya su credibilidad, sobre todo de cara a los inversores, etcétera, va a quedar, yo creo que bastante perjudicada si esto se produce, ¿no? Entonces, me parecía bastante relevante. Bueno, vamos a seguir escuchando la parte final, que quedan ya 1 minutito y medio de entrevista, así que vamos a ello.
Change the inflation target above 2%. In Spain, some economists talk about the ECB too, the target of inflation. What's your opinion about that?
That already moves into the credibility area, right? If you need a really good reason, especially if you decided in August 2020 that inflation, your framework is going to be anchored in inflation being very benign. If within less than 5 years you change your inflation objective to something higher than 2%, I think you need a very, very good reason.
Mm-hmm. Do you think debt ceiling negotiations may end up hurting U.S. prospects?
Yeah, I think if that doesn't get resolved against the background of slowing economic activity and lower credit growth, that definitely could be another pressure point.
Mm-hmm. Just a last one that I want to ask you is, what is your opinion on the dollar? And do you think it can strengthen further or
Well, the dollar is an interesting currency, even though we saw some stresses in the U.S. banking system that percolated globally through global financial conditions. The dollar strengthened nonetheless, and that tells you that the importance of the dollar as a reserve currency is probably its preeminent feature. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. So as I said before, thank you very much for having me here, and it has been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bueno, pues espero que os haya gustado la entrevista. Aquí la tenemos, entrevista en exclusiva con Sonia Meskin. Simplemente os digo, si me veis desde YouTube, que subiremos este contenido, resubiremos, por favor, comentad, porque a la hora de comentar el vídeo nos posiciona mejor. También si le dais a like nos posiciona mejor, así que lo sepáis, que si me veis desde YouTube y veis el vídeo, like, suscribirte si no estás suscrito y por supuesto dejar tu comentario.